Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, the Vice President of Product Strategy here at Zimperium. I'd like to welcome you to another webinar. We are in the middle of running through a series of webinars on various different compliance mandates. This one happens to be one that became into effect in 2018 down in Australia, and a lot of our customers down in Australia are having to work with the NDB, the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme, for mobile devices, and I'm going to go into a little bit about the scheme itself, the NDB scheme, as well as obviously talking a lot about mobile. So before we dive in, the usual perfunctory comments. We will make slides available to anybody. We also have a brief on this topic that you can pull off our site if you're interested. I will take questions at the end if there are any questions. If not, then that's fine. We don't make them up. We don't find any value in that. It'll be about 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes of content. And then please, hopefully you'll find value in this. We're getting a reputation in the market of being consultants to a lot of companies on mobile security and mobile threats and the like. So please follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, all the rest of that fun stuff. So with that, let us dive into the presentation and go from there. We always like to kind of frame this up a little bit and talk about a little bit of the approach to this entire thing. The presentation in classic format, we're going to kind of run you through, here's some facts. We'll tell you what the facts are, then we're going to tell you what it is, and we're going to come back and hit you on the other side. So very similar to, obviously, a sandwich. You got bread on a couple sides, you got the meat in the middle, and we're going to run through the entire thing. So facts about mobile security and NDB. First, as long as NDB has existed and been in effect, it has included mobile. So we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the components of that and how it factors in just a second. Second, we're going to go into this. 60% on average in the enterprises and institutions that are covered by NDB are mobile. And we're going to talk about kind of the case of that and why that's relevant in this scheme of things. These mobile devices are absolutely under attack. There's absolutely no doubts about that. We're going to go in, we're going to talk about the individual attacks and all the various different shenanigans these guys come up with that try to attack mobile devices and why they're doing it. And we'll cover those and explain the most important ones as it pertains to mobile security and NDB. We're going to talk about the requirements. We say they're explicit, but they're not prescriptive. There's different types of compliance mandates, and some of them, like PCI in the payment card industry or HIPAA in the healthcare industry in the United States, are very prescriptive. These are explicit, but they're not necessarily prescriptive. But we're going to go into what those are. And then, of course, even though this is not designed to be a product pitch, it also kind of makes sense to say, okay, we just got finished talking about these things being under attack and the need for a solution. What are some elements of the solution? So I'll spend very little on the solution itself. This is really more designed to make people understand kind of how NDB and mobile kind of come together. We always like to set this up because a lot of people are saying, well, how real is the threat? Are mobile devices really under attack? Short answer, yes. We now literally have thousands of customers worldwide, tens of millions of endpoints. 100% of our customers detect threats. So 100% of our customers detect the type of threats that the hackers are using as they're furtively running around, hiding in the shadows, trying to make attacks. The reason they're able to do that is because there's no visibility on these endpoints. Something that's really important as we get into this is that word that I just mentioned, endpoints. And that is this. An endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint. If you have patient data sitting on a tablet, or if you have PII data sitting on a smartphone, in the NDB case, another example, it's identical to if it's sitting on a desktop or a laptop. So as a result of that, we need to factor it in. And since NDB and all these other compliance mandates are basically saying, hey, look, you need to protect PII, personally identifiable information on any endpoint, the fact that mobile is one of them is critical. Now, there's a couple time-tested security outages that I want you to keep in mind as we roll through this. The first one is this: land and expand. As long as there's been cybersecurity, the bad guys have basically said, we're going to go after the weakest link and then make our way in. Well, today, 60% on average of the devices accessing enterprise data, potentially having access to PII in the NDB scenario, are mobile. We've literally spent billions and billions of dollars securing 40% of the endpoints. And those 40% of endpoints, laptops, desktops, servers, et cetera, quite often don't even leave the confines of where we spent another billions and billions of dollars on network security. Now you've got these mobile devices. Quite often these mobile devices, the user is the admin, by the way. They're the ones who decide what they're going to update. They're the ones who decide what networks to connect to. They're the ones who decide what networks to attach or what apps to install. And by the way, it spends 80% of the time outside of that protected network. So in the land and expand scenario, the reality is mobile devices are an absolute prime target today. But are they under attack? I already pointed out that 100% of our customers have detected attacks on mobile devices. But what exactly are the attacks? Well, there's 4 primary attack vectors, all sorts of nuances within here. The second time-tested adage that I want you to remember, security law, if you will, is the concept of persistence. As long as there's been bad guys, and as long as bad guys have attacked our devices in a cyber standpoint, they have actually gone out of their way to remain persistent. So in order to expand in the land and expand scenario, you need to own that piece of territory. You need to own that device. In mobile, the only way to do that is to remain persistent is to actually compromise the device. Why is that? Well, that's because one of the big changes that the operating systems have made in mobile, both iOS and Android, is all the apps are in containers. They're all in buckets. In the traditional endpoint security world that we're all used to, apps could come on the device and they could go sideways into other apps. You can't do that in mobile. Malicious apps in mobile, as you see on the right-hand side, completely untargeted, designed for fraud. Click fraud, ad fraud, et cetera, banking fraud. That's what malicious apps are for. Phishing is a real issue. We're going to talk about phishing here in the context of NDB in a quick second. And phishing on mobile is a real issue because 90% of the breaches, according to Verizon last year, so you got to believe it's applying also to a lot of the NDB stuff, which we're going to talk about because it does, started with a phishing attack. Well, 2/3 of emails are now read on mobile. And given the fact that some of those emails that are being read on mobile are on the personal side of mobile, it can actually lead to a compromise on the corporate side. So malicious apps are untargeted. Phishing, even though it's a real issue, it's also untargeted when it comes to the company. Zimperium was built from the very beginning to protect enterprises against targeted attacks. So if a bad guy was going after XYZ Bank in Australia to try and get PII and a bunch of cardholder data, bank holder data, et cetera, they're not going to drop an app in the App Store and pray that somebody downloads it from the bank. This is not going to happen. What's going to happen is, because they're very good at what they do, is they're going to set up a fake Wi-Fi network directly across from XYZ Bank's headquarters. They're going to wait until somebody from XYZ Bank headquarters comes in, connects to it, thinking it's the Wi-Fi of the coffee shop, and they're going to take over the device. So in the end, when you start looking at all these things, it's important to note that there's a real synergism between all of these things, but it all points directly back to compromising the device. You could use a malicious app to deliver a payload to compromise the device. You could use a phishing site to not only steal credentials, but also compromise the device. But the real way to do it is a network-based attack. Again, though, the key is to compromise the device. All of our data across all industries shows that 90% of targeted attacks begin with a network attack. 90% of the time when somebody is targeting XYZ Bank, they're going to start by owning the network. And that's going to be real important when we talk about how do we solve this. So file that in mind, and then we'll come back to it. So what are the hackers' goals? Pretty straightforward. Same on mobile as in a lot of other places. We want credentials. If we can steal your credentials, we can actually access other things that might actually be the place where the PII data is hanging out. We obviously want the data. That's the whole thing of a breach. We're after the data itself. But then there's also weaponization. In the case of an enterprise mobile device, for instance, if I can weaponize your device by compromising your device at that fake coffee shop I was talking about just a few minutes ago, then when you walk into XYZ Bank's corporate network, I can go sideways again in this particular scenario with the goal of trying to capture data. So the objectives are very straightforward and well known. So let's talk about NB. I keep stuttering over this. NDB scheme about mobile. First, some thoughts about NDB overall. For those folks that don't know it, but if you're living in Australia and if you're listening to this webinar, chances are you're pretty familiar with it, but it's just good to baseline it. Any business in Australia with annual turnover exceeding $3 million can be susceptible to this. It basically states if there is any hint of a data breach, you need to have prompt notification. The notification is actually 30 days, which means you need to be able to notify it, know about it, and then notify the authorities on it. And of course, in classic fashion, because you always need to have the stick, there are fines that come with it. I think it's interesting that there's fines for individuals as well as organizations. But the one that obviously matters most is the fine for organizations themselves. So this went into effect in 2018. We just thought it'd be kind of fun, but let's look at the data just for the fourth quarter of 2018. There were 216 notifications under the scheme just in the fourth quarter of 2018. I think it's kind of interesting to kind of look at this, and I apologize for it being a little bit small, but there's three things I wanted to get on. They break it down and they basically say, okay, so there are these breaches. Now let's look and slice and dice the data, and you can go pull this information directly. The breach or the brief we've got actually has a link directly to the OAIC's notifications and this information I'm looking at here. But it'll say, hey, for each one of these breaches, was it intentional? Was it insider? What was it? One of those categories is malicious or criminal activities. And if you look at it, you can see that the vast majority of them came from an actual cyber attack. So the majority of the malicious attacks came from a cyber attack of some way, shape, or form. Now, it's interesting to say, you know, up there, you've got this little thing of social engineering and impersonation. I actually think that should be included in the cyber incident category. And you say, okay, JT, you write your own report then. Well, I'm going to be. We're doing our own global threat report, which will be coming out in early July. But the reason I'm saying it is, I mentioned phishing earlier. So this now comes and says, okay, we're going to take all of this information from its cyber incident, just that bottom bar, and say, how does it break down? Well, you notice that the vast majority of it is phishing. Last time I checked, social engineering and phishing are strongly correlated. So social engineering usually ends up in a cyber incident. Now, there could be some social engineering thing where you trick the security guard to do something physically, but the majority of it really has to do with this. But I think it's interesting to look at these things. And the reason I think it's interesting is not just because I think it's cool, even though I do, because it's related to what kind of solution should you have, right? So phishing, huge majority of it. You can see malware was like 7%. Now this information on the cyber incidents is not just mobile, right? You see things like ransomware. By the way, sometimes mobile devices, we've seen it repeatedly, mobile devices deliver ransomware, right? Stolen credentials. A lot of times that happens from somebody who's on their mobile device giving up information, whether it's from phishing or something else. So this is pretty interesting. And then I thought this was particularly interesting. This now comes back to the criminal activity again, similar to chart 1.6 off on the left, and talks about the top 5 sectors. And as you can see, there's cyber incidents, then there's insider threat, social engineering again, and then theft of device, et cetera. In a mobile scenario, that quite often is the whole reason people have invested in EMMs, right? What happens if somebody steals my device? Well, I'm going to be able to check it. I think it's interesting that finance was number one when it came to cyber. And I'm going to come back to that because it's not just, for instance, employee devices. Finance also has a huge mobile app, for instance, world that can be used as a conduit to give up PII. Healthcare, and what I thought was interesting was mining and manufacturing were tied for cyber attacks. So this is just kind of, and then legal, we have a whole bunch of legal customers. But what's interesting is most of the time for us, the legal customers, and it says legal, accounting, management, so there's a whole bunch of things. I think it's, in this case, probably more accounting than legal. We have both. The accounting stuff quite often has more PII related. The legal stuff usually has more corporate related, information on their clients is the reason that they're protecting it. But it is just kind of interesting to kind of break all these things down and take a look at it. When it comes to the mobile components itself, since they are responsible, we mentioned 60% of the devices in the enterprise actually are mobile. These guys have a ton of data that's associated with it. As such, since the beginning of NDB, they've had to be covered. So what are some of the security stipulations? I mentioned that they're explicit in terms of what they're asking for, even though they're not necessarily prescriptive. There's a list of them that we have that we can provide to you, but here's three that I think are relatively important for our conversation. The first one is that access to the records must be restricted on mobile and nothing should be stored locally. Again, this has to do with what happens if you lose the device. What happens if a hacker actually takes over that device and therefore has access to all the files that are on there. But it also has to do with access. So any of those records, you got to restrict it. You got to have some sort of a means of being able to do it. When it comes to some of the cyber related stuff, you have to cover multiple access levels, including some of the ones I was just talking about. Device, app, network, and content protection, I think is a pretty interesting one as well. Now, phishing is not mentioned explicitly, but if you look at the data, there's a good possibility it's going to start to be baked into this whole thing, because a lot of times people have a tendency to think of the original three, device attacks, malicious apps, and bad networks. Content protection sort of might fit in there, but I don't really think so. So I think this will be expanded, obviously, to include phishing. Because the bottom line is, it's all about, did you get breached? It's not about how you got breached in terms of your responsibilities, right? And then you have to have real-time monitoring. Why do you have to have it? Well, it's what I refer to as a BFO in the business, a blinding flash of the obvious. But in addition to just common, security, hygiene, and practice, I mentioned that you have a defined timeline that you have to be able to, once you've been breached, you need to be able to notify the authorities. Well, if you're not monitoring things, you don't know you've been breached. You can't actually start that entire process. And once you have been breached, you need to have the forensics and the data to be able to back it up. So all of these things apply on mobile every bit as much as they would on any traditional endpoint. So with that, then we pivot and we say, okay, got it. 60% of the endpoints are mobile. They're holding a whole bunch of PII. They're completely covered and exposed and is susceptible to the NDB compliance requirements. They're under attack. So what do we do about it? Well, I mentioned, let's keep this in mind. I'm not going to go through all four of them again. I'm just going to highlight again, 90% of the targeted attacks that start this whole approach on mobile start with a network attack. Said differently, that means 9 times out of 10, the bad guy owns the network. And since the bad guy owns the network 9 times out of 10, Zimperium knew this from the beginning, because we didn't start off as a consumer company and then tried to move into the enterprise. We have been an enterprise company from the very beginning. So we were trying to protect targeted attacks against XYZ Bank in my fictitious example. So we knew the bad guy was going to own the network 9 times out of 10. We knew that you have to do 100% of your detection on device. Gartner has now really started reinforcing that. If you talk to the analysts, they're much stronger about this. But Gartner, they need to be kind of careful in kind of how they discuss stuff. But you can see even Gartner is saying better likelihood of protection persisting over a compromised network. Like I said, in person, they'll be even stronger about it in terms of the pros and cons of all the various different attack vectors. But the key part is you need to do detection on device. And we've known that forever. Zimperium has one core engine. It's called Z9, and it can detect on device known and unknown attacks across the 4 attack vectors. Z9 can be rolled out in one of 2 ways. If you're trying to protect your employees' devices 100% of the time, let's say the ones that are accessing PII data, things like that, you would use a product we have called ZIPS, that stands for Z Intrusion Prevention System. It's basically next generation antivirus, next generation EPP, if you use Gartner terminology, endpoint protection platform for mobile. 100% of the time, protecting your device, the data, the access on that device. If, however, as I was mentioning for the financial services example, you have a mobile app, we can put Z9 with an SDK, software development kit we have, directly inside of any mobile app. In that case, you're not trying to protect the device 100% of the time because you don't own the device. Let's say it's a consumer banking example. But you're trying to protect the session that app is having, again, in the NDB scenario, to protect the PII that would be going back and forth, let's say in a consumer banking example. I use consumer banking, A, because finance was the #1 cyber attack in NDB, but also we have many customers, and one is an easy example of both of these for me, a major financial institution, that one of the biggest in the world that we work with, that is using ZIPS to protect hundreds of thousands of their employees, and they're using ZApp to protect tens of millions of mobile banking users. So it's a perfect scenario. Both of those come back into our console, management and administrative console called Z Console. Another huge advantage of doing all of our detection on device, our console is 100% cloud agnostic. We don't care what cloud people want to put it on. As an enterprise company, we always believe that we should fit into your world, not you should fit into ours. There are alternatives to us in the market, of course, because every real market has alternatives. Almost all of our major competitors, actually all of our major competitors, do cloud-based detection instead of on-device. They're trying to pivot into the on-device world. But as a result of doing all of their detection in the cloud, their consoles are locked into one cloud, and that's AWS. We love AWS. We work on AWS. But we have a lot of customers, specifically customers that are, say, going to Microsoft Intune, that want Azure. Or there's Google Cloud, Oracle Cloud, et cetera. We don't care. Behind Z Console is a capability called Z3A. It stands for Advanced App Analysis. There's a lot of perfectly legitimate apps that are in your environment that are not malicious. Malicious apps will be detected by Z9. But on your employees' devices, there could be a bunch of very legitimate apps. But because mobile apps are put together with a bunch of libraries and SDKs like Legos by their developers, sometimes on purpose and sometimes on accident, those legitimate apps have security and privacy risks in them, where traffic could be sent to a foreign country. Traffic could be sent to unencrypted off the device. Well, if your mobile devices have access to PII and they can do some of these things, even if they're not quote unquote malicious, you're still subject to a breach through those. And so you need to know what those apps are and create custom policies to deal with them, depending on the individual group that these people are in. If they don't have any access to PII, you might not have any policies. If they do have access to PII, you might say, look, we're not going to allow any app that's in here that actually sends traffic to a foreign country. I personally put that policy in place. Behind the console, we integrate with the largest number of EMMs. We're also the only ones who can handle multiple EMMs in a single tenant. So if you're moving from one to another, or if you inherited two, doesn't matter to us. We also have put our agent, the Z app, directly inside the Mobile Iron agent. So for Mobile Iron customers that want 100% coverage right off the bat with no additional administrative work, they just say yes, and it shows up. It's already sitting there, it just gets activated. And then I mentioned you need all this data from a monitoring standpoint to be able to meet the requirements of responsibly disclosing the breaches in a quick period of time. All of our forensic data goes directly into SIM solutions. I should also point out here, we've got the most granular ability to actually handle data. We can go from the most intense, the most amount of forensic data coming from a device. Let's say if these are the guys that actually are employees on devices that are corporate owned that have complete access to PII. We want every piece of information that comes off there. We, though, because we're doing all of our detection on device and because we thought about this in the very beginning, we also can be in environments where no data leaves the device. So for instance, here in the United States, Mayor de Blasio of New York City not only was protecting the employees of the city of New York with ZIPS, he wanted to provide a free cybersecurity solution to all the residents of New York City. And we basically have a version of Zips called NYC Secure that's available for free in the App Store and Google Play Store. No data ever leaves the device. So from a privacy standpoint, which is obviously critical to NDB, depending on use cases, we can play across the board. So with that, I am going to stop and see if there's any questions. I do want to thank you, and once again, encourage you to follow us on all the various different social media so that you can stay on top of the mobile security threat landscape. So I do not see any questions, but I would just like to thank you again, and remember that there is a brief on this on our site. We'll make the archive available within the next day or so. And we'd just like to thank you guys once again for giving us your time. We really value it. Have a great day.